Now we're going to talk about the election system. The system in Australia and in Mexico is very different. In Australia, the federal elections are every 3 years. In Mexico, the elections are every 6 years. I think this differentiation is because in Mexico we've had many different dictatorships. So if you give only 3 years, a 3-year period for every president, it might increase the probability to be another dictatorship. The monarch's representative in Australia is the Governor General. His duties are mainly to call elections and to appoint ministers. We're going to talk about it later. But it's mainly a symbolic function. The Governor General has the authorization to dissolve the Parliament. But the final decision is on the Prime Minister, who is the main leader of the government. The previous Prime Minister felt that he didn't have enough support of the Parliament. Therefore, even though he had the majority of support, it wasn't very relevant. This man anticipates elections thinking that he would have absolute majority. However, this wasn't the case, so he called for elections earlier. In an established government, there was a prime minister, but he felt that there were some crises. Therefore, he asked the crown to dissolve the parliament. This is not a common scenario. I must tell you that. This is a very rare case. So what I'm saying is that the monarch and the governor general, they have a very symbolic role in Australian politics. Regarding elections, everyone older than 18 has the obligation to vote, and if you don't, you have to pay an amount of money. In the case of someone who is going to travel outside Australia, the government can send an email to make it possible for this person to vote even outside of the country. In Australia, the culture mainly doesn't have confidence problems regarding electoral fraud, like, for example, in Mexico. I think that it doesn't matter if there are a lot of laws in the electoral system. If there's a culture of fraud, the fraud is going to stay. The legal age is 18. You can drink and vote and drive at that age. There's this thing called preferential vote. It doesn't exist in Mexico. But in Australia, the situation is different. The members of the Senate, the senators, are elected by proportional representation every 6 years. Now, I'm going to explain the preferential vote. This means that the voter has to organize his or her preferred candidates. The candidate with less votes is eliminated. What does this mean in political terms? In Australia, there are lots of political parties. Mainly, the small parties have to negotiate with the bigger parties to make alliances. There is a very funny case here. There is a small political party that has a similar name to a bigger one. So sometimes people confuse their names and vote for one when they really want to vote for the other. In the voting card, the Australian voters can write just a number one to imply that you want all your members of the parliament to be of this political party, the number one. I was talking about the Electoral Commission. I think I mentioned it on the previous slide. You can search it online if you want. But let's go back to the preferential vote. It has to be ranked in order of preference. Here there's a big problem. It's called donkey vote. By that I mean that normally voters, they are sometimes a little bit lazy and they just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of actually rank them. So sometimes some political parties end up beneficiating from this donkey vote. In order to avoid this donkey vote, they establish a different order. This is very interesting because in Mexico this doesn't happen. When is the day of elections, they don't make more campaigns. Here there are two main points. The first one is regarding the election of the members of parliaments. But who is responsible for making the campaigns? When a party wins the elections, its leader becomes a prime minister, becomes the main leader of the nation. Therefore, the person who leads the campaigns is the possible prime minister. As you see in the slide, this ballot is an example of the Australian elections. I think something very important to mention is the fact that in Australia, the campaigns don't last very long in comparison to Mexico. For example, in Australia, a prime minister can call elections and say, we're going to vote in 2 months. So in just 2 months, all the parties have to organize its campaigns. In Australia, there is no much political activity compared to Mexico. For example, in district elections, you might just go for a walk and meet a possible candidate, and you get to meet him in a more personal level instead of seeing all the ads on the streets.